My name is Chelsea Leyland, and I am a DJ, and I'm also a medical cannabis activist. And for the last 2 years, I have been working on a documentary that explores the current landscape of medical cannabis, looking at both the UK and the US, with a particular focus on epilepsy and other neurodegenerative brain disorders. And really, the nucleus of this film is my personal experience and that of my family's with our struggle with epilepsy.
That was actually a brilliant introduction to what I'll start off talking about for about 10 minutes, then we'll hand it over to Chelsea. And I'll talk about some of the known science and try to tease through what is fact and what's fiction when it comes to cannabis. And just a brief little bit about myself. It really resonated with me what Bill talked about earlier today, because as the son of Asian tiger parents, when I was in medical school and I said I wanted to go to business school as well, they were like, "That's crazy. What are you doing?" And then after I graduated from medical school, I said, "I don't think I actually want to practice as a doctor. I'm very interested in this cannabis phenomenon. I think I can push the research in science and education forward." And they just their heads exploded, and they're like, "What's going on?" But it really is that generalist mentality that I'm able to kind of tackle this appropriately and push the ball forward. And so what I'll be talking about today is we'll talk very briefly about the history of cannabis. Then we'll talk about what's actually inside the plant, and then we'll talk about the good and the bad health effects that we know about. And then later on today, Jess will be speaking more about the kind of consumer trends that's happening in particular with things like CBD. So before we get started, let's start with a little terminology. So whether you call it marijuana, or you're calling it indica, or sativa, or you call it hemp, or you call it, pot, dope, Mary Jane, reefer, ganja, the shticky icky, or my personal favorite, the devil's lettuce. It's all cannabis. All of this is cannabis. Cannabis sativa. That is the name of the species of plant that produces all of these other colloquial names. And when do you guys think the first kind of written, recorded human interactions with cannabis appear? How long ago? Take some wild guesses. 5,000 years. That's pretty close, actually. So it was about 3,000 years ago. And what civilization do you think first wrote about cannabis? Come on, throw out some Incans? Further east, way further east. Keep going east. Yeah, the Chinese, right? And this is actually the Chinese character for cannabis, and it's the same Chinese character as numbness or anesthesia. And it was this gentleman, Emperor Shen, who first wrote about the medical uses of cannabis. And presumably he named it because one of the effects he wrote about was that he noticed that it relieved pain. And so again, he assigned it the word for numbness to it. And actually, there's an interesting story here because one of his court officers, they asked him, "Emperor, how did you discover the medical uses of cannabis?" And to that he replied, "Well, I smoked it, but I did not inhale it." It's like the one joke I got this whole talk. That's all I got. So make it last. Keep the laughter going. That's all I got. Okay, so after the Chinese first wrote about it, you see documented medical uses of cannabis appear in the ancient Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians. And it wasn't until about 1850 that it shows up in the US Pharmacopoeia, which is the official listing of all recognized medicines in our country at the time, where it was listed there for about 100 years. And if you look at all the uses of cannabis that were listed in there, there's a lot. And some of them probably weren't accurate. I mean, science wasn't that great back then. But there's a few uses that I want to draw your attention to. Alcoholism, opium addiction, nerve pain, and seizures. And that's because today, 179 years after these first appeared, the medical community is having a serious discussion. What does cannabis do to alcohol consumption, to opioid consumption, to pain, to seizures? But 179 years ago, US doctors were prescribing cannabis legally for these conditions. All the way up until 1940, you'd walk into a pharmacy and you pick up a tincture bottle made of cannabis. So medical marijuana is not a new phenomena. In fact, it's a very old phenomena that has only been prohibited for the last about 70 years in our country. All right, so shifting gears a little bit, what is actually inside the cannabis plant? And so first, a little bit of anatomy. So when you're talking about the stalk of the cannabis plant, it has really sturdy fibers. And that's what we colloquially used to call hemp. And you can make clothing out of it, you can make construction materials, wood replacements, bioplastics, you can even make battery parts out of hemp fibers. But it's really the flower of the cannabis plant which is sought after for its recreational as well as its medical uses, because that's where it has the most dense cannabinoids, things like THC, things like CBD. And in fact, when the flower gets pollinated, that's when you get cannabis seed, which is the same thing as hemp seed, which I had for breakfast this morning, and I'm sure many of you have had in grocery stores. It's a superfood. So again, one plant, different parts of the plant we've kind of assigned different nomenclature to. But on the topic of cannabinoids, again, there's THC, CBD, which by now I'm sure most of you have heard about, but those are two of over, how many different cannabinoids do you think are in the cannabis plant? Over 100, yeah, exactly. And we don't know what a vast majority of them do. They've never been studied. But speaking about the two that we know a lot about, so there's THC, which is responsible for the intoxicating effects. CBD is non-intoxicating. THC does have addictive potential. I'll talk more about that later. CBD has no such addictive potential. THC can cause motor impairment, so there's worries about stone driving. CBD doesn't do that. THC can cause hunger, the munchies, I'm sure some of you are well aware of. And CBD does not do that. So at face value, they're both cannabinoids, but you look at this and you're like, that's two very different profiles. But there's also areas where they overlap. And so they both have anti-pain properties, anti-seizure properties. They're both antioxidants, anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer, neuroprotective properties. But the caveat here is that for most of the things under the line, we've only studied them in animals. The human research has been systematically restricted, systematically defunded. It's been very difficult to advance this beyond the animal research because of the ways the laws are structured. So we don't know if these effects exist in humans. Now, you might be wondering, how is it that this cannabis plant affects our bodies? Well, that's because all humans have an endocannabinoid system. And it's not just humans. Everything from fish to frogs to birds to your dog all have endocannabinoid systems. We naturally produce cannabinoids. And this endocannabinoid system is distributed throughout your body. It's involved in everything from mood and memory to sleep, appetite, metabolism, immune function. So when you're ingesting cannabinoids, your body is reacting as if it were its own naturally produced endocannabinoids. The cannabis plant is mimicking this natural system in our body. All right, lastly, closing off with some of the health effects, good and bad, okay? So in terms of THC, here's actually what we have strong evidence for, where we've actually done human research. We know that THC can treat nausea. We know it can help people who are losing too much weight, so someone who's anorexic, and it can treat chronic pain. That's pretty much where it ends. And then we have some very early evidence in humans that it can help with PTSD and something called Tourette's syndrome, where you have these involuntary tics. Notice what's not on here, right? What's not on here is Alzheimer's and treating your actual cancer tumors and all these other things that you might hear about. Even insomnia is not on here. Depression is not even on here. They just haven't been studied in humans. All right, but what about CBD? Again, strong evidence for pediatric epilepsy. And that's it. That's the only good human research that's been done on CBD. And then there's some very early emerging research that CBD can treat opioid addiction. It can actually help schizophrenia and actually help social anxiety. But again, notice what's not on here. Insomnia, pain, depression, inflammation, autoimmune conditions, all the things that if you go online and Google CBD, you hear people talking about. It just hasn't been researched. Again, systematically restricted and blocked, systematically defunded by government agencies for the last close to a century. That's why we don't know as much as we do. And lastly, let's talk a little bit about the potential negative health effects of THC and CBD. And I'll run through these pretty quickly. So interestingly, CBD can actually help schizophrenia. THC might actually worsen it. Just shows you how complex this issue is. so schizophrenia. And then also THC use during pregnancy has been associated with some negative consequences in the fetus, in the baby. So it should be avoided during pregnancy. THC use in the adolescent brain, you also see associations with deficits in cognitive function, so it should be avoided. And THC is addictive, right? A vast majority of people that use THC do not develop any sort of problematic use, but some people do. And lastly, driving, you actually have a doubling of your increased risk of car accidents while you're acutely stoned. Now, for all of these effects right here, and this is where I might get like booed out of the room or get like tomatoes might start throwing at me, for most of these effects, if you compare it to something like alcohol, it's actually, in each one of these domains, it is arguably less harmful. It's less deleterious on pregnancy than alcohol. It is less addictive. It is less damaging to the adolescent brain, but it still has harms, right? So it's not harmless, it's just less harmful than something like alcohol, right? And then lastly, surprisingly, lung cancer. We actually don't see an association between smoking cannabis and lung cancer. We don't know why, but basically there's no evidence that smoking cannabis can lead to lung cancer. Now, in terms of CBD, the main concern is drug interactions, that CBD might boost levels of other drugs you're taking, okay? And then those drugs might have side effects. And then we don't know what CBD does in pregnancy. It's never been well studied. And we don't know about the long-term consequences of CBD use. If you're using it for years, what happens to you? So those are kind of the main issues that we're still thinking about right now. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chelsea, and then at the end, we'll open it up for some Q&A and discussion. Great, thank you. Do you need this?
I have like 2 slides. I'll take one.
Thank you, Jeff. And so I'm bringing more of a sort of personal experience of using cannabis to treat my epilepsy and sharing a little bit about my journey. My journey starts with epilepsy. My sister Tamsin started having seizures as a baby. And for me, you know, my earliest memories were of growing up with a sister with special needs. And so really that for me was normal life. I have early memories of my sister being in and out of intensive care. She would fall into what's known as status, which is where there is back-to-back seizures without the brain having more than a 10-minute break in between. And for those of you that don't know anything about epilepsy, epilepsy is an umbrella term for a condition that when the neurons fire in the brain, the overfiring of neurons can cause seizures. You can develop epilepsy from having an accident. It can be due to your genetics. It can be triggered by stress. So you know, there are many varying degrees of epilepsy, and my sister has what's known as intractable epilepsy, and that is drug-resistant epilepsy. And so we grew up, and I in my family was known as the little carer, because from an early age I helped my parents care for my sister. I was always able to detect when things weren't right. But as I said, that really for me was normal life. And at about 7 years old, my sister left to go and attend a special school. And I remember that being quite difficult when she left home and wasn't able to live with us anymore due to the severity of her condition. And really for me, I think I only began to realize that perhaps my sister was a little different from other people when I mentally outgrew her. And as a result of my sister's condition and having numerous seizures, it damaged the frontal lobe of her brain, and therefore it affected her, you know, cognitive function, and her brain wasn't able to develop properly. I remember spending a lot of time in and out of intensive care. I was calling the ambulance from a very early age. I always, as I said before, was able to detect when my sister was, you know, out of sorts. But, you know, she was a naughty child, and I have really amazing memories because she didn't really have a filter. I remember when we were at the same school when I was younger, my sister would always do things that she wasn't meant to. Because she had special needs, they weren't really ever able to tell her off. And I have a really funny memory of being called out of a classroom because my sister had climbed up the fire escape and was at the top of the fire escape yelling, and they couldn't get her down. And so I had to leave class and come and help the staff to get my sister to come down. But if I could describe my sister as a child, if there was a red stop sign button, she would press it. If we were on an escalator, in an elevator, anything that she could do that was a little naughty and she wasn't meant to do, she would. And so I was the cognitively healthy sibling. And at about age 13, I started to notice that when I was in the car, often when the light was coming through the window and was dappled and flickering on my eyes, I would get these sort of blackouts, this strange sensation, which was, I often describe it like an interruption, like a matrix interruption. I could be sort of mid-conversation and then I would lose my train of thought, but it was like a little mini blackout. And I remember telling my mother, you know, when the light flashes on my eyes like that, it makes me feel funny. And she would turn around and she would say, don't worry me, don't worry me. And I think, you know, for any of you that have grown up around sickness or with a sibling or a parent, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of trauma in the family. It's very difficult. And I think the thought of perhaps something being wrong with me, my mother couldn't even begin to imagine. These jerks, I call them, which I now know as myoclonic jerks, because I suffer from juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, they began to increase. Every time that the dappled light would come through in the car, I would notice that if I was watching TV and a music video and the lights were flashing, I would have these. And they started to happen in the morning, in clusters. I would be drinking my tea and having my cereal, and I would have these interruptions, and I would drop whatever I was holding. I mean, it almost became quite funny because in the morning I would go through sort of 3 mugs, 2 bowls, and they would smash to the floor, and my hands would jerk, and as my hands would jerk, I would have these interruptions, and they continued for a while. And at this age, I was actually attending a school outside London, and I would go to my doctor and explain the situation, and he continued to tell me there was nothing to worry about, and that this was just a side effect of being tired, and this was something that happened to a lot of people. And they continued to get worse, and I continued to return to the doctor and with the same response. And on my 3rd visit, he said to me, you know, that most likely it was psychosomatic, it was actually trauma, because I had grown up with a sibling that was so sick. But I should go and see the neurologist just to be sure. I went to see the neurologist. I explained my story. I explained about my bowls dropping in the morning and you know, my cups of tea. And without much thought, he looked at me and he said, you have juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, which was historically known as flying saucer epilepsy, because in the morning people's saucers would go flying. And as you can imagine, it was a real shock, I think, because epilepsy had been such a huge part of my life and my family's struggle. And it didn't really make sense to me, given that I felt normal and healthy in every other way. He recommended that I be put on anticonvulsant medicines to try to control these myoclonic jerks that I was experiencing. And I chose not to take medicine. I'd seen my sister taking so many pharmaceutical drugs that I think the thought of taking any medicine frightened me. And a few months later, after visiting the neurologist, I had my first grand mal seizure. And I'm not sure how many of you have witnessed a seizure, but it's quite a frightening sight to witness. So someone falls to the ground and they convulse, and there's a loss of consciousness. And after my first seizure, I was then told that I would have to start taking medicine. It would be unsafe, not to be on any anticonvulsants. And so I got put on anticonvulsants, and I continued to have seizures. I continued to have these myoclonic jerks. I continued to have grand mal seizures. I had a seizure in the shower once with the door locked, and my father had to break down the door because he could hear me convulsing in the bathtub. And so they put me on a new medicine, and they switched it around. And I think it was challenging being a teen and being diagnosed with something like epilepsy. It was challenging that I had a sister also with the condition. And I think it was heartbreaking for my parents. And I noticed that my personality changed when I was on this medicine. I was also told by my family that I became very aggressive. I was having regular panic attacks. My anxiety was through the roof. I wasn't sleeping, which was also challenging because my seizures are caused by sleep deprivation. So I was taking this medicine on the one hand to control my seizures, but it was also keeping me awake and making me hyperactive, and I needed to sleep, and that always confused me. My sister's condition has unfortunately, continued to worsen over time. She has tried nearly every anticonvulsant out there. She has a vagus nerve stimulator implant, which actually saved her life, but she still continues to have seizures. She can have up to 70, 100 seizures a day, and is often in and out of intensive care when she falls into status. 3 years ago, I was sent a video, I'm not sure how many of you have seen it, of a little girl called Charlotte Figgis. And I watched this video of this little girl whose parents had given her medical cannabis. She was given CBD, and her seizures stopped. And as I watched this video, I didn't believe it. I think when you have suffered from seizures yourself and you have seen someone you love suffered from seizures yourself, it is very hard to wrap your brain around the fact that this little bit of cannabis oil was treating her condition. But I became curious, and a few months later, I was put in touch with a cannabis activist in the UK who actually introduced me to cannabidiol, CBD. The first time that I used CBD, I noticed a change in the way that I felt. It was as though I was Humpty Dumpty and suddenly all the pieces had been put back together. I felt like I had been plugged into a power source. It reminded me of what life was like before epilepsy. There was sort of a sense of calm. It was just like I felt grounded. It's hard to articulate what it feels like not to feel well in your head. But it wasn't that I felt high. I didn't feel different. I just felt balanced. I felt normal. I now know that to be that my body was falling into homeostasis. I forgot to take my traditional medicine that evening. I forgot to take my anticonvulsants, which I would never, ever forget to do. And the reason I wouldn't forget to do that is because my brain would remind me in the evenings that it was pill time, because I would start to feel a little funny, a little out of sorts, a little off. Perhaps my memory started to, I would forget things just mid-sentence, and I would always know, okay, it's pill time now, I'll take my pill. So this was not a regular occurrence to forget to take my medication. And I woke up the following morning with the initial thought of utter panic of, oh God, I forgot to take my medicine last night. And then followed by this inquisitive thought of, wait, did I forget to take it because of that little bit of oil that someone gave me? And I thought, no, that's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. It wouldn't work that quickly. But I felt curious, and I began to do some research, and I bought myself a bottle of CBD. I didn't know what I was buying. I didn't have a general practitioner that I could consult. I didn't have a neurologist that I could talk to. And I began to take this CBD. And very quickly, my life started to change. Initially, I was sleeping 12 hours a night, which was very strange. Suddenly, I was able to sleep. It was like I was catching up on all this sleep that I'd missed over the years. And again, I felt this feeling of calmness. And I felt well in my head. And every day that I was on it, my life was continuing to improve. Just my cognitive function, my ability to remember things, just the way that I was performing day to day. And I began to take CBD every day in conjunction with my medicine. And after 6 months, I decided to slowly wean myself off of my anticonvulsants. I tried to speak to my doctor about it. I tried to speak to my neurologist, and I tried to speak to my family. And everyone told me that I was irresponsible and that it was very dangerous. And I trusted how I felt. And after 6 months, I weaned myself off slowly. And I've now been off of anticonvulsants for around 2.5 years, and I haven't had one seizure since. So it's completely transformed my life. But my journey is interesting because I felt very alone. I was let down by the medical system. I didn't have that support. There wasn't any information to follow. There wasn't a guidebook. I didn't know if the product I was using was tested. I didn't know if it was safe, if it was consistent. I didn't know where it was being grown, where it was coming from. All of these questions I now know to be so important. And so cannabis really has dramatically transformed my life in so many ways. To be off pharmaceutical drugs was really a dream for me. And my older sister Tamsin, who lives in the UK, at the Epilepsy Society, does not have access. I'm based in New York. I'm lucky that there is a medical program in the state that I live in. I'm lucky that I have a condition that is on the list of qualifying conditions. And I'm lucky that I have access to a medical grade product, a standardized product. And my sister, although there was a change in legislation last November in England, and now technically cannabis is medically legal in the UK, my sister remains without access. So the work that I'm doing is really trying to share my story, to educate, to raise awareness, and to fight for patients like my sister that are most vulnerable. Jeff mentioned before that epilepsy was on the list of conditions that we know that CBD can help, but if you noticed, it was pediatric epilepsy. And so there is now a drug called Epidiolex that's been tested and has gone through clinical trials, but because it's for pediatric epilepsy, my sister Tamsin, who's 36, isn't able to gain access. So really that's my story, and I think it's interesting to be here as we're talking about consumer packaged goods. And had I not have had access to some of these CBD products, I wouldn't be in the position that I'm in today. I'm not using Epidiolex, so I'm not using this licensed medicine, and so I was able to play around with different consumer packaged goods to try and treat my epilepsy that way. So thank you so much.